Welcome to the SIWIKE podcast, the only podcast that shares the stuff you didn't know you needed to know about jobs, careers, and life. The SIWIKE podcast, the stuff I wish I knew earlier.
Hi everyone, and welcome to the SIWIKE Stuff I Wish I Knew Earlier podcast. We're here with one of our new guest hosts, Dan Marquez, and we have
Hello.
a bit. How's you doing, Dan?
Pretty good. Can't complain.
Sounds good. So he comes to us with a background in consulting, tech, and business, and a whole bunch of other things. And we go way back to our consulting days. And I'd love for Dan if you can share a little bit about what you're doing now, and then we'll go back in time and go through your history. So,
Sure.
What are you up to these days?
So currently, I work at Google. I'm part of the Google Cloud business. I work as a customer experience account lead, which means that I work on behalf of some of our larger clients, and I'm the person working with those clients to help them think about, the arc of the transformation that they are on to move to the cloud and trying to get value out of their move to the cloud.
Sounds good. So before we got to that point in your life, what was Dan like as a kid? So maybe some early fond childhood memories. Were you kind of the rambunctious, outgoing kid? Were you like the nerdy techie kid, or was there something else in the mix? So what was Dan like as a kid?
This question feels like a trap.
No traps.
Yeah, so I mean, I was definitely a geeky child. I played a bunch of I played a lot of Magic the Gathering. I played a bunch of games and stuff. Played D&D with my friends and everything. So we were very geeky. I was interested in that kind of part of the universe for pretty early on. I was also a theater kid from a very young age. I think in grade 1, I was involved in little kid theater stuff and did extra theater stuff on the side, on the weekends. So I've been a theatrical person most of my life, and that continued on through school. I was in the theater company in my high school. I was involved in the U of T engineering theater company, which is called School Night, when I was at U of T. I did that for 4 years, and then I directed that show, and then I come back every year as a former director to help with the show. So yeah, a combination of, I don't know, geeky theater kid was me with a kind of scientific bent. I certainly had that aspect to me too, and I recall my dad always emphasizing that I should be an engineer when I grow up. I think because when he was growing up, all the people that ended up being successful that he was surrounded by ended up being engineers. So that was his view of what good looked like. So that was always in the back of my mind. And then at various points during my childhood, I had different kind of arbitrary objectives that I kind of locked in. At one point, I remember just hearing people say, oh, that's good, but it's not rocket science. And I'm like, well, it sounds like rocket science is the best thing that you can do, so I'm just going to do that. And that just arbitrarily became my objective for what I was going to do with my life for 5 years. So yeah, I think that honestly that's the way that I've approached a lot of goal setting in my life, and it hasn't necessarily been the best way to do it, but it wasn't the worst either. Setting your sights on some arbitrarily lofty objective and then falling a little bit short of it still usually ends up landing you somewhere pretty good. So.
Sounds good. I'd love if you dive a little bit deeper into some of these areas, because not all of these things are really synonymous with each other, right? So I picture a science kid, a little bit more kind of shy and introverted, and then you have this theater aspect of it, and then again the geeky kid again seems a little more shy, and then you have the theater aspect of it as well, right? And kind of rocket science and engineering thrown in. So I'd love if you kind of share was there any of that like shyness or the outgoingness? Because I know you as one the most outgoing people I know. Right? So how does that
kind liar? I'm a good actor. No, I mean I think that's probably sort of the default assumption of what a geeky kid looks like or a nerdy kid looks like, but I don't think that has to be true. Mm-hmm. I think that if you think of a lot of some of the more famous geeky people, they're pretty outgoing people that have combined geekiness and nerdiness with other things and ultimately kind of brought that towards a successful result. I think I've always been, and it's come through into my professional career. I've always been someone who is both like interested in like what's underneath something, but also interested in like distilling that down and simplifying it, right? Like I think when I was a kid, I would always say like, I'm not afraid of any problem because all I need to do is take some big giant problem and just like tear it down into its component parts, and then I can solve it that way.
Right.
So I guess that probably gave me like courage that I hadn't earned, but it also changed the way that I approached problems and thought about problems. And similar was true of like, public speaking or being on stage, whatever. Like I just viewed it as something that I can break down into its like, I don't have to be afraid of it because it's like this big scary thing. I'm just like, well, I'm delivering this line. I'm like focusing on this character. I'm highlighting this aspect of my experience. I'm just sharing it with people. I happen to be on a stage, and I think that I don't think those things are incompatible at all. I think that's probably just like a misconception.
Yeah, I really want to kind of test kind of that default assumption because there are lots of stereotypes on there, and there's always sides of the spectrum. So I just want to kind of poke into that because I know that you're quite different than the typical.
Well, and I do think back. If there's one thing that I suspect played a role in this, when I was pretty young, like my parents gave me a lot of like extra education, especially on stuff like math and science, and like like the crunchy grilling you on like your multiplication tables and just like to the point where things like math become muscle memory. I think that has played a meaningful role because I think a lot of kids that go and they look at math and science and they get scared about it. It's because it's not a comfort space, right? I see it nowadays in my professional environment. I see a lot of executives shy away from technology and digital change and all these topics, not because there's not value there, but because they're fundamentally foreign concepts, right? They don't understand it. They don't know how to engage with it on an intuitive level, and so they shy away from it, even to their detriment. And I think that as kids, people do that with math and science, and they're like, well, it's not cool. Well, no, if you knew how to do it well, and you would like it, and then it would be interesting because it's all about puzzles, and like that's me in a nutshell. I'm just always doing puzzles all the time, right? Like when I'm working, it's all like trying to solve problems and like break down complexity. When I'm not working, I'm playing board games, I'm doing escape rooms and stuff. So, I think once you get past that hurdle, it makes this stuff like easy and interesting, and then it opens up all these doors. But a lot of people I think don't end up getting there, which is too bad.
For sure. It reminds me of a quote where there's no such thing as problems, only puzzles to be solved. So it's one of those things that there's always an answer. It's whether or not you want to dig into it. I'd love if you chat a little bit about like that confidence that you had. Was it kind of nurtured through like the math, the science tutoring, or did you always have it as a kid, or like is there some combination of that? I don't know if you can recall.
No, I mean I think. Well, I think like being up on stage and doing acting and stuff when you're like too young to know that you're supposed to be afraid of it helps, right? Because it's just like it implicitly builds a connection between like being in front of people is not a scary thing, and it's just like it's built into you as a kid. And then the same with like learning all this math. It's like, okay, well I did all this stuff. Now when I go and do it in a classroom, it's like super straightforward to me, and I don't understand why everyone is so stressed out. I think that these things build like fundamental confidence in yourself that you're not registering. You're just like, well, I don't know why everyone is so worked up about all of these things. It's similar to, I've always had a rule that I realized early on in my professional career, which I think has served me well. And Luki, you'll probably remember from our time at Deloitte, like I was relatively junior, but I was one of the most relatively junior people that seemed to have like a lot of senior connections to partners, and like I was pretty comfortable working my way through the partnership and talking to all these folks. And the rule that always served me well is like a recognition of the fact that these people, by merit of being senior, they're not better than me. They are older than me, right? They're like me, but time shifted, right? And now some of them are straight up better. Like I'm not pretending that there aren't people that are better than me, right?
Sure.
But just like your seniority is the result of the extra time that you've had, and I want to respect the wisdom and the experiences and everything that you bring to the table, that doesn't make you a superior human, right?
Sure.
So if you think like that, it means that you can bring a peer relationship to the table with senior people that I think is often, to some people, is an affront. And like those are the people you should avoid anyway because they suck. But to the people that really matter, it's refreshing because it's like, I'm coming to the table. I know that you are bringing your expertise and your depth of knowledge and everything. I'm bringing fresh perspectives, and I'm not afraid to tell you about them.
Right.
And there's an opportunity for like a peer level collaboration there that they don't really get, I think. I think a lot of senior leaders are a little bit lonely because they wish that they could have like more energizing conversations with more dynamic people that were willing to engage in these kind of peer level discussions instead of being afraid of them.
Yeah,
That's my hypothesis, and it served me pretty well, except for the times that it's like rubbed people the wrong way, where they want me to feel cowed by their seniority, and I'm like, well, I don't care. I'm not want to work for you if that's the way you want to interact.
Yeah. And there are always spectrums of that, right? So there's always going to be a population that
For
will kind of fit that typical vision where thou shalt bow down to me because I am senior and older versus like, you know what, like this is an engaging conversation. And I like what you said about kind of that time shifted part. And I would probably argue a little bit that no one really is better than you because they've just time shifted with a different priority, right? So if you decide to go down that path, you could probably get to that level too if you did that.
Maybe
as well.
like Einstein is better than me, like straight up better. Like Malala here, me here, right? There are people that are just like, shaped by their experiences and probably shaped by experiences that I would never have had access to. Are just like amazing humans, and so be it, right? But I get your point that I think given access to similar environments and similar choices, you could probably end up as a similar person. But I think because that's not true, invariably there are going to be people you look at, you're like, wow, amazing. But I think that like that relationship works the same in the other direction. Like as someone that is now, that has had leadership opportunities and leadership roles, I strive to be the person that is opening the door for discussion that engages everybody in the room, because like I know that I don't have all the answers, and I'm always worried that by imposing my own position on something, I'm going to cut off engagement to the person that actually has the real knowledge or the data or a new point of view on something that I would never have thought of. And it's the reason why I often like frame positions that I have as questions to at least like invite debate on my point of view. Because I don't want to be the guy that is the only voice in the room, right? I spoke at a conference recently, and one thing I said in that is, you show me an organization where the CEO believes they're the smartest person in the building, and I'll show you an organization that isn't going to last. Right? And I think if you can't harness the collective brain power and intelligence and passion and everything of everybody, if it's all just like a spin cycle around one person, like you can't compete in the market if you're not tapping into the full potential of all of your people, or at least the good chunk, the smartest chunk.
That's amazing. Yeah, there are lots of words of wisdom and nuggets in there, and I almost take it even as some of your points about like that confidence piece. It could almost turn into a bit of like a parenting podcast where, in order to instill confidence in your kids, you get them on stage early, get them into math and science, and not be afraid of it, and then they'll be too maybe naive to think otherwise, and the confidence will be ingrained. And then obviously, I love the points about like if you're the smartest person in the room, you probably want to get into a different or a better room, that sort of thing. It reminds me of that sort of quote. But I love we kind of connect back to your history, because there would probably be a ton of deep dives in here. But if we talk about you on your path to kind of your engineering stream. So you mentioned that your dad kind of planted the seeds early on, and what was that trajectory like? So you were acting and you were
so
like
through high school I was I went to an art school in Vancouver, but I also had like AP classes, so I was kind of doing this dual pathway of I was doing like a lot of theater stuff, but I was also in like AP calculus and science and math and everything, right? So I had a joint passion for both things. And I think around the end of high school, the question was like, which is kind of my major and which is my minor? Like, which is the
Right.
priority for where I'm spending most of my time, and which is the relief valve, or vice versa,
Yeah.
right? And I think that the desire for, I think relatively speaking, I'm a somewhat risk averse person. I will acknowledge that. So I think that the desire for like the safe bet that I can complement with this other side of me won out. But I often think about what like the alternative version of my life might have looked like, if I had been like a tinkerer on the side, but I had moved to LA to explore my aspirations as an actor or a writer or something. But no, so I went, I knew that like I was interested in both of these sides. I applied, I got into the engineering science program at U of T before it was like completely impossible to get into. Like I know now the kinds of marks and stuff that you need to get into any engineering program, let alone engineering science at U of T, is like pretty wild now. So I fear for I fear for my daughter's generation and their efforts to get into to university. But yeah, that was the decision I made. I decided I wanted to move geographically. I wanted to kind of strive for what I thought was the best program out there, which was engineering science, and went for it. And that that shaped a lot of my life. I realized pretty quickly that engineering science then wasn't for me, and that what I really enjoyed was actually industrial engineering, which is basically like the engineering of complex systems, right? Whether they be businesses or societies or all kinds of things, right? Or like ergonomic machines, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I just thought I found the space of like design and dealing with complexity to be the thing that was most compelling to me. So I pivoted, and at the same time I also got into theater at U of T. So I kind of regained that dual track mentality. And like did like 20 other things on the side, right? I was the chair of the industrial engineering club and blah 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 blah.
Yeah.
I don't know.
You're
I'm
always
one of those people that's
active.
always on. Yeah.
Yeah, always active, always doing something there with a full schedule and all that. And I love if you kind of share a little bit about that path to consulting, because that's obviously where you started most of it, and then a lot of your career has been in that realm. Like, was that on your radar early, and were you grooming yourself there, or what was that thought process like?
No, it was super late. Honestly, I went into my final year of university still not having really spent a lot of time thinking about what I wanted to do, which bad on me. Really should have deserved more thought. But no, I kind of had conversations with my peers, and for some reason in my mind, the process of finding a job was something that happened at the end of the school year, and then like some of my classmates were like, no, dude, it happens like in the first week. Like if you're not working on getting a job right now, like you're screwed. And I was like, oh no, okay. So then I started looking around and thinking about what I wanted to do. I applied for a few jobs. I applied to 3 jobs. I applied at Canadian Tire, Merrill Lynch, and Deloitte.
Okay. Very different.
And I was like, yeah, I know, because it's just like they all sounded vaguely interesting. And I got all 3, I think. But yeah, I was wary of consulting because I'd heard a lot of like horror stories of consulting, the industry just being kind of a meat grinder and being like kind of where creative people go to die, and so like I wasn't super interested, but I was like, well, I'll give it a shot. Like I mean, I've heard mixed things. I've heard that, but some people say that consulting's really good. They did an experience year there, things like that. So I applied. And honestly, what turned me around on Deloitte was the interview experience itself, which I think you were actually there for.
Probably.
I
Yeah.
think you were part of that process. So good on you, Luki. Yeah, no, the people that I met through the process were so interesting and so down to earth, and so, seem to not hate their lives, that I was like, okay, maybe this is worth considering, because like I would love to be one of those people sitting here having this conversation on the other side of that desk, doing the kind of work that they told me that they're doing. And so I gave it a shot, and when the three offers were all in hand, I looked at them and was like, okay, I think that this makes sense. And for context, that was in the technology consulting part of the Deloitte business. So I knew that I definitely wanted to do something related to technology, and actually that's an interesting story. During a couple of summers preceding when I started, I did some work at a company called Ingram Micro as like a financial planning analyst within their financial planning and analysis group. I did that for 2 summers, and I worked with a couple of really amazing people. Greg Cummings is namely the main guy. I worked with a bunch of amazing people that really gave me the latitude to kind of like make the role whatever I wanted it to be, with the objective of like just help us find opportunity, find efficiency. So I ended up kind of becoming their data wizard, and being the person like running Excel spreadsheets and Microsoft Access databases and stuff to like crunch data and find insights that could be applied to the business. And I was good enough at it that they hired me back just to do that. And that's when my first real professional epiphany was like, wow, technology when applied well is kind of like business magic. Like, why, if you had the ability to literally apply magic to your business, right? Like if you had a magic wand to wave on parts of your company, what kind of crazy leader wouldn't take advantage of that, right? Like that would be insane. And so that was the realization that the kind of like scale of value that great technology can generate is like orders of magnitude. It's tens, hundreds X what you put in. And so it's like, okay, anything I do is going to be centered around the idea of I want to change businesses with technology. And so that, that was at the core. All 3 of the roles I had applied for were all kind of centered on that in one form or another. But I thought at Deloitte I'd have the opportunity to do that the most. And that's how I got into consulting. I just wanted to work at the intersection of those 2 concepts.
Yeah. And I'd love if we explore a little bit about kind of that decision process between the other 2. So was it really just one-sided where Deloitte was the hands-on winner, or was it like, you know what, I'm not sure, maybe, and it's kind of hemming and hawing a little bit, or what was the decision process between the 3?
Yeah, I mean, so I think the backdrop was the interview at Merrill was not very good. Whereas the people, I could see myself as one of the people I interviewed with or was surrounded by when I was at Deloitte. The Merrill one was like very adversarial. It was like, it was not a good vibe, right? Like I value culture very highly in terms of like where I choose to work. And like that, I did not get a warm and fuzzy feeling from that. So like I did not see myself there. That wasn't really an option for me. Right. Canadian Tire seemed like a really amazing place. Like the culture of everyone I met was really excellent and stuff. So that between those 2, it really came down to the nature of the role. I felt that I'd be a little bit, my growth potential would be more at Deloitte, and it wouldn't be as narrow. I'd get a more diverse set of experiences because I knew I had a general thesis about what I wanted to do, but I didn't have a specific idea about exactly how I wanted to apply it yet. So the idea of Deloitte seemed much more compelling that way. And then on top of it, like I would be lying if I said that I didn't value like brands and recognize the value of a brand in terms of like how it attaches to your own personal brand and the career equity that you're able to accrue. And so, I mean, I thought, the Deloitte brand is going to be a meaningful one to have in my pocket. And I think that's been something I have valued as I've moved through all the stages of my career.
For sure. And just to make sure that folks are aware, I mean, these are anecdotes. I'm sure there are a bunch of nice people at Merrill as well that could have the culture.
Those specific people were not great. Just those specific people. But I mean, I think that's an important thing, right? Like, if you're gonna recruit people, if you're gonna be public in any meaningful way, like you got to put your best foot forward. Like, don't send Grumpy Jim to go and interview people because it's gonna it's gonna, put a bad taste in a lot of people's mouth. I don't know. It seems like a bad choice.
100%.
Anyway.
Yeah, and that's what we tried to do with the recruiting process when I was leading the team, is just make it like this is a place where you want to be. So I'm glad that it kind of
You
had
did
the
it.
results that we
You
wanted.
did it.
So thanks, Dan. I'd love if we kind of walk a little bit through that consulting journey, because obviously Deloitte, then Accenture, BCG, and now Google. It's consulting, but slightly different. If you can kind of walk us through a little bit of that journey and kind of the differeces, I'd love if you kind of share a little bit of that journey.
Sure. Yeah, so Deloitte was a really great place to start in my career, right? I got to meet a lot of really excellent people. I learned a lot very quickly. I think I got involved in a ton of stuff. Like, Deloitte is kind of a place where, like, you are allowed to fill up your plate to an unlimited degree, even if it's maybe not the healthiest choice. But it gave me access to all kinds of stuff, all kinds of learning. I think it was really rich. Obviously, I think, like, there were some downsides. For me, I certainly saw Deloitte as a relatively political environment in comparison to other places that I've worked, which just means that it's an upside and a downside, right? It can mean that it's, like, even better in some spots. It can be worse if you find yourself, like, having to deal with folks that you don't see eye to eye with.
Yeah.
But overall, like, I was quite happy, and I could certainly see myself, like, going places there. Partway through, about 4 years into my career, I was approached by Accenture that was in the midst of a big push to try to scale up their, what was called at the time IT strategy, what eventually became tech and digital strategy practice. And it was something I was trying to do. It was something I was trying to focus on more, and I was doing some of that work. But Deloitte is a very hard place to, like, pivot inside of. Like, there's not a lot of internal mobility. I think maybe because of the partnership model, or at least that was my individual experience. Like, other folks may have had different ones. But so I knew that if I wanted to focus on this work, doing it within Deloitte was probably going to be difficult. And so I decided to move and to make a change, and I think that worked out well. I was at Accenture for 8 years. I had a lot of different roles. It was very formative for me. At the end of my time there, I was leading I don't know if I would call it practice, but it was like a focus area within a broader practice around digital and technology transformation leaderships. How do you shape digital and technology transformations? I think I was recognized as sort of the go-to person for digital strategy. I was a thinker on this. I was a member of a program they created called the Innovation Fellowship that was actually really, really fantastic. It gave a handful of leaders like myself the latitude to kind of go and explore a space that they thought was important and do research and engage a team. And I did a lot of my work around the idea of, like, why do companies that get disrupted, what could they have done to be more resilient proactively to disruption? And I did a whole series of articles on it called the Gospel of Resilience. And so that was great. And then I decided that I needed another change about 8 years into Accenture, and I had another decision to make. Right, so I took my time. I put a lot of feelers out in the market. I was exploring, like, at least a half dozen different options. One of which was, a couple of other consulting firms, including BCG, where I ultimately ended up. I was talking to folks in venture finance. I was talking to a couple of other tech companies. I was talking to a mid-sized corporation that was looking for a chief digital officer. So a lot of different potential roles. Timing-wise, it ended up that I had the BCG offer and a couple of other offers on the table at the same time, and I felt that, like, the place where my net potential for growth would be highest was at BCG. And I think MBBs are an interesting set of organizations to work for. Like, the growth potential, the learning potential is amazing. Being surrounded by so many, like, ultra smart people is a fascinating place to be, and I learned a ton in my time at BCG, like, especially about how you prioritize value, how you really think about not just going after things that are good or nice to have, but what does real value actually mean for this organization? How do you make sure it's lined up with what the company is trying to accomplish? And then how do you go from not just talking about it or targeting it to actually running it to ground and like capturing it and getting it on your books? You know, I don't think there's any organization better than BCG at accomplishing that. You know, having a good idea of where there's value to be had, and then like running it to ground and getting it like into your bottom line. So that was you know, a sight to behold. And then Google came calling, and the prospect of working. So one, I mean, I'd been fascinated by digital native organizations and their cultures and their behaviors for a long time. Google is probably one of the best examples of that in history. Yeah. And so the idea of having the opportunity to actually work for one and be inside one was kind of too compelling to pass up. And so I made the change, and I'm still there. And you know, partway through my time at Google, I've made a move role-wise. So I started in the professional services team as like a delivery executive responsible for the delivery on an account. And then, you know, I think recognizing that I was pretty good at my job, there was a pivot so that I took on the role as the overall person responsible for the customer experience at the big accounts that I work for.
That's amazing. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of areas where I'd love to do a deeper dive in, probably for a different episode, because that would just open up a can of worms. But as we start to kind of close off the discussion, so first of all, thanks for sharing that journey and kind of the different decision points along the way. But if you were to share or summarize a few pieces of SIWIKE, the stuff I wish I knew earlier, I know you already shared a lot of them, but are there any kind of like 1, 2, 3 that you'd say like, yeah, I definitely want to make sure that the world hears about these. So what sort of SIWIKE would you say are your top, call it 3, if you had ones to share?
Well, as I mentioned to you before we started, I'm the chair of the board for an organization called the University Consulting Group, which does pro bono strategy consulting for charities and nonprofits in Canada. I gave a talk recently for the kickoff of that organization. It was for the September cycle, and I gave a talk called 10 Things I Know Now That You Should Know Too. And I think, you know, I was probably subliminally motivated by this upcoming conversation with you, Luki. But I think there's a few from that are probably worth highlighting. And I think I've highlighted one already, right? This idea that like seniority is a fiction, and that like ignoring it respectfully is a good kind of path forward for oneself in both directions. But there's a couple that I would probably highlight. So I mean, one is probably the most controversial that I think I called out in this presentation, which is, in my experience, it is important to recognize that style is more important than substance. And I think that is it's not to say that substance doesn't matter, right? Like good ideas, good execution, all these things, like they really matter. But the point of that audacious comment is that none of them have a chance of creating any value, of being meaningful in any way, unless the style side, unless perception is effectively managed. You can take a good idea, you can talk it up until the point where it finally actually gets traction and then turns into something real. But something great that is poorly communicated, poorly engaged, will always die on the vine. Like, build it and they will come is crazy. It doesn't work. You know, like perceptions have a tendency to become reality, right? Narrative is a thing that gives things momentum, that encourages people to buy in, to sign up, to provide their money, to provide their sweat equity. You know, and people make choices lightning fast. And once a choice is made, usually people are much more reticent to change their position than they are to have made it a certain way in the first place. So not thinking about the style, not thinking about how things are perceived is like the first step to failing every time, right? Like things do not win on their merits. Things win on their merits and how those merits are communicated. So that's thing one. I mean, just if you take anything away from this, it's that, right? Like, it's so important, and so much more important than I think anyone gives stuff credit for, right? Like, the number of times I've seen amazing pieces of technological change fail because of change management, or because the wrong operating model is put around them, or because the culture was not set up to support that change, is myriad, right? Like, it's probably one of the most common reasons why things don't work out. I think, I alluded to it. Culture is so much more important than I think in every, for yourself. Like, don't work at a place that has a culture that you can't abide, right? Or don't work there for very long. If it's going to be purely transactional, so be it. But like, a bad culture, it like grates at your mind, at a willingness to engage, at your ability to harness energy and apply it. Great cultures are, for me, they are indicated by a lack of that cognitive dissonance that comes with mediocre cultures. I don't know if you know what I mean, but when you hear leaders say one thing, but then the structures in the organization seem to be forcing you to do something different, right? That's a poor culture, where the intent and the structures don't line up with each other is a poor culture, right? And it just forces you to like work harder to accomplish your everyday stuff. That's what creates burnout, right? Amazing cultures, it's very hard to burn out in an amazing culture. In a terrible culture, burnout is almost a guarantee, inevitably. The last one that I often think about is, decision making is so much more important than I think people appreciate, right? Like, good decision making, which means it's made at the right time by the right people that are well informed, that have access to the necessary information and insights. That's the lifeblood of organizations and of individuals, right? Like, the ability to make a good decision and to be comfortable with the decision that you make. Yeah, it's just, I think it doesn't get enough recognition for how important it is. And like, the organizations that I've seen that are really amazing, they invariably tend to be the organizations that have an outsized ability to make good decisions where they need to be made, right? So like, do they empower the frontline worker to make a choice on behalf of the customer in real time without repercussion? Are leaders that are making big long-term strategic decisions, are they making them on instinct, or do they have real data to back up their decisions that they're analyzing appropriately, right? Like, it's a huge differential, but often it gets overlooked because, like, well, I'm a smart person, this sounds right to me, I'm going to go for it. But so often you see the opposite, right? You see a bunch of like smart, well-off people sitting around a room talking about what the experience should look like for this like single mother that makes $40,000 a year, and it's like, well, you have no lived experience to inform you about what that person wants. Did you even ask her? No. So those examples, I see them over and over and over of like poor decision-making practices, and it's usually indicative of mediocre organizations, or organizations that are setting themselves up for unnecessarily hard times. All right, that's it.
Good.
Those are my three pearls of wisdom.
That's perfect. And what I took from that is for the last one on the decisions is having the data, and part of empowering the frontline workers is they have the data, right? They know what their customers want.
Yeah.
So empower them to do that, which I think is amazing.
And it's not necessarily like crunchy
culture.
data the way we think about it, right?
Yeah.
They have the context, they have the insight.
Right.
I mean, there was like a famous story of Tim Hortons from years ago where like a frontline worker at a Tim Hortons gave a Timbit to a little kid that was having a bad time. For a customer, the mother came in every single day, and it's like, hey Susan, looks like your kid's having a bad time. Here's a Timbit, and then that makes all the difference. And then she got fired for stealing, and it's like, come on, you got to know that that's not a good idea, right? And like, anyone would intuitively look at that and understand it's a bad idea, but the systems and structures they had in place made it impossible for that good decision to be made.
For sure. I mean, context is king in those types of situations. On the one for culture, what I took from that is you got to make sure key indicator is folks that walk the walk. There's congruence in there where people do as they say versus they say something and then something else happens. That's definitely important. And then the one on style, I'm reminded of like a Peter Drucker quote where he says that businesses are just marketing and innovation, and that's kind of the same thing, like style versus substance. So the marketing is really like, if you can bring it out to the world and communicate it well, that will really help things be adopted easier. So I think a lot of great advice. So thanks, Dan, for joining us. And if folks want to reach out to you and maybe hear a little bit more about kind of future aspirations, what are some things in the future that folks can look forward to hearing from you, and where could they reach out and connect with you?
Yeah, so I am findable on LinkedIn pretty easily. I'm Marquez D on LinkedIn. That's usually the easiest way to get in touch with me or to engage with me.
We'll link to that.
But I have a whole series of articles I've written in the past on a variety of topics like effective decision making, kind of the future of like digital organizations, how organizations can be more resilient to disruption. A lot of these topics I've explored, in written forms on my LinkedIn page. And there's some other topics that I am planning on covering in one form or another down the road, especially the decision making one. So I think that those are things you can look for, but I'm always interested to engage with folks that like are curious about these topics or have their own perspectives and want to engage. So feel free to reach out to me that way.
Yeah, sounds good. And maybe we'll see you in a theater production later on in the future.
Maybe. I mean, I would honestly, I would love to. I think my days on the stage have probably passed me by, but I still like to do a lot behind the scenes in terms of like writing and directing where I can. So.
Sounds good. So thanks so much, Dan, for joining us and sharing your story, and hopefully we'll have you back for a future episode.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thanks, Luki. Thanks for the invite.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks for joining us on the SIWIKE Stuff I Wish I Knew Earlier, the podcast. If you like the podcast, please subscribe on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you found this podcast. And if you can give us a review, that would be very appreciated. Feel free to contact me on LinkedIn at Luki Danu, LUKIDANU, and the same on most social media platforms. And I look forward to hearing from you. Thanks. Bye.